Hello and welcome back to more High Peak. Well, after 15 years in the used car business, I thought I'd share with you some of the most unreliable cars I know of. And some of these might shock you. Some of these are from brands that you'd expect to be absolutely bulletproof, and they just aren't. This list, by the way, is my own personal first-hand experience. I've been bitten by each and every one of these cars several times. Anyway, let's get to it. Number one then, the first car on this miserable list is the Nissan Qashqai. Now specifically, this is the Mark II Qashqai, which ran from 2014 until 2021. The Nissan Qashqai is a very popular car and I really can't work out why. They're just not very reliable. You're far better off buying something like a Kia Sportage instead. They offer the Qashqai with a petrol engine or a diesel engine, as an automatic or a manual, and none of them are particularly reliable. I've had them with bad timing chains with as little as 40,000 miles on the clock, and to correct that you're looking at around £1,500 to replace, so it's quite a costly job. If you go with one of the diesels, you can have issues with the DPF clogging and blown injectors, and again, another expensive job. You can have turbo issues with both the petrol and the diesel, because you see even the petrol Qashqai has a turbo. It's a little 1.2 litre turbocharged petrol, and I think you're asking too much from a little 1.2 litre engine. When they're running, they're okay, but they just won't do the miles. It's also quite common to have issues with the handbrake, with the power steering, and also with the reverse camera setup. With regards to the gearbox, if you go for a manual, they're not too bad, but the automatics, they're not great. The early ones used a CVT, which just aren't reliable at all. If you have a CVT Qashqai, you need to service the gearbox every 30,000 miles, otherwise it will fail, I guarantee it. They later replaced the CVT with a twin-clutch DCT, and that was no better either. The changes were quicker, but they weren't any more reliable. So basically, if you think about buying a used Qashqai, don't. You're better off buying a Kia Sportage or pretty much anything else. Number two on this list will genuinely surprise you. It's the little Honda Jazz, which is also known as the Honda Fit in some markets. Now, the model I'm talking about here is the Mark I. Now, this ran from 2001 until 2008. While some can be reliable if they've been maintained well, I've had an awful lot that just haven't been reliable at all. This mostly surrounds the gearboxes. So the manual gearboxes can have bearing failure, which means you get a very whiny gearbox, and that's quite an expensive job to fix. Or if you go for an automatic, they use a CVT gearbox, a bit like the Qashqai I mentioned previously, and they're just not that reliable. If you haven't had them serviced regularly, when you set off, there'll be like quite a pronounced judder through the cabin. Now you can flush the gearbox and service it, but it'll never be 100% again. The other thing you need to watch for with the early Jazzes is rust. They are prone to rust terribly. They also let water in the boot. This is because the rubber seals in the boot perish and then they let water in. I've also had a few over the years that have had bad timing chains, so they're not as reliable as people think. They're also quite prone for having issues with the door locks. They can just seize up and they need to be replaced. Generally speaking then, if you're after a small little city car like this on a budget, you'd be far better off buying something like a Toyota Yaris or a Suzuki Swift. Number three on my list then is the very popular little Ford Fiesta. Now specifically I'm talking about the Mark VII, which ran from 2008 to 2017. Now before you have a go at me, because I've said in other videos the Ford Fiesta is quite a good first car, the model I'm talking about is the 1 litre EcoBoost. From 2012, Ford developed this little 3-cylinder turbocharged petrol engine, and it just wasn't good news. They also fitted that EcoBoost engine in the Focus, the C-Max and the Mondeo, and it's always a headache. So if you want a Ford Fiesta, just don't buy that 1 litre EcoBoost. You're far better off with the 1.4 or the 1.25 or even the diesel. They're far better, they're far more reliable. The little EcoBoost engine was quite a remarkable engine when it first came out, because the actual engine block itself was as big as a piece of A4 paper. But it uses a wet belt for its cam belt. And over time, people don't change the oil on time or they use the wrong oil. Then over time, the rubber belt disintegrates and fragments of that rubber then cause serious catastrophic engine damage. It's also a very expensive job to replace the cam belts on those, because that wet belt is something like a 15-hour job as opposed to a 6 or 8-hour job to replace a standard cam belt. Instead of the cam belt being on the outside of the engine, which is quite easy to get to, on a wet belt EcoBoost, it's actually inside, so it requires an awful lot more of the engine to be stripped. Also, if you're looking for an automatic Fiesta, then avoid the power shift. The power shift gearbox just isn't a reliable gearbox. If you've got your heart set on an EcoBoost, then at least make sure it's got full service history, preferably by a main dealer, and make sure that it's had its timing belt replaced. Now, the wet belt's due to be replaced on that every 10 years or 100,000 miles. But to be honest with you, I just avoid it. Just go with the 1.25. It won't be as quick or as fun, but they're a really good little car. I'm a big fan of the Mark VII Fiesta. I just think that EcoBoost was just a terrible design. Before we get on to the next unreliable car on this list, I just need to say a big thank you to today's video sponsor, Car Vertical. I always use Car Vertical. I'll leave the link below in the video description, but it's really easy to use. All you do is go to carvertical.com and type in the reg or the VIN. Once you type in the reg or the VIN, it produces a really thorough, detailed report. So it checks database in 35 different countries. It'll tell you if it's ever been stolen, written off, had a mileage rollback, or has outstanding finance on it. In addition to that, it shows you the ownership changes, the reg plate changes, the spec, the average market value, the MOT history, and a whole lot more. If you want to do one of these checks for yourself, and I urge you to do so before you hand over any cash for a used car or motorbike, there are just so many dodgy cars out there, don't end up buying one. Make sure you use my promo code HIGHPEAK, that's HIGHPEAK all one word, HIGHPEAK, for 20% off each and every check that you do. And you can use that promo code as many times as you like. Thanks Car Vertical for sponsoring today's video. Right, back to the list. Number 4 on the list then is another incredibly popular used car. It's the Fiat 500, or also the Ford Ka. Underneath, they're basically the same car. Now, this Fiat 500 ran from 2008 until 2017. This is the all-new Fiat 500, which ran from 2008 to 2024, and they were incredibly popular, and I like them very much, but they're not the most reliable. I think they look really cool and really stylish, and it's every girl's dream first car, but there are a few things that you need to watch out for. The most common issue I face with the 500 and the Ford Ka is gearbox failure, both on the manuals and the automatic. On the manuals, the bearings can fail and you get a horrible noise coming from the engine. So when you drive it from maybe 20 miles an hour onwards, you'll just hear a complete racket basically. This needs a gearbox rebuild and it'll cost you the best part of £1,000. Sadly, this isn't something that just happens to high mileage examples either. I've had this on models with only 30,000 miles on the clock. They're just cheap and not the best built. Now, alternatively, you go for an automatic, they use a semi-automatic gearbox and they're not much better. The automatics use an automated clutch system, so it isn't a full proper auto, and they're just not reliable. Again, I've seen these fail at 25,000 miles. I've also had issues with the electronic power steering system, I've had issues with the door locks, the electronics, and also the sump pans rust very easily. Whenever we get one of these through the garage in stock, we always end up spending far more than we should just to prepare them for sale. You can buy them quite cheaply, but you also need to sell them quite cheaply because there are just so many out there, so your profit margin is quite slim. Then you end up correcting all the faults and there's kind of no profit left. That's been my experience anyway. Still, all that said, I do quite like them, so if you've got your heart set on one, then I wouldn't be too put off. Just make sure it's got full service history, make sure the odometer reading isn't flashing, make sure all the doors work and the windows work, make sure there's no noise coming from the gearbox, and fingers crossed you might be okay. For number 5 on this list, we're heading back to Japan, and I think this one will genuinely surprise you. It's the Mazda CX-5. When you think of the Mazda brand, straight away you think you're going to get some reliability. But with the CX-5, or specifically the 2.2 litre Skyactiv diesel engine, that just isn't the case. They use this same engine in the Mazda 6, by the way, so be wary of that as well. I think the CX-5 itself is a really good looking car. It's a really popular SUV. It's practical, it's kind of the perfect family car. But avoid those 2.2 litre diesels. Unfortunately, I've had this several times where you just get a complete engine failure and you end up spending £5,000 for a replacement motor. This is why I just avoid them completely. Again, you're just better off buying something like a Kia Sportage or a Honda CR-V. They also have issues with the DPF and the turbocharger, but the main issue for the engine seizing is due to an oil pickup pipe. It gets clogged and then it leads to oil starvation and then the whole engine just seizes. Unfortunately, it's just a flaw in its design and Mazda really should have recalled them, but they didn't. If you're adamant you want a CX-5, then go for a petrol instead and just avoid those 2.2 Skyactiv diesels. The last car on this list then is the Peugeot 208. Now, a bit like the Ford Fiesta, this only relates to one specific engine. It's the 1.2 litre 3-cylinder PureTech. Now, they use this little unreliable 1.2 litre PureTech engine in, are you ready for this? The Peugeot 108, the 208, the 2008, the 308, the 408, the 3008, the 5008 and the Rifter. This PureTech engine is very similar to Ford's EcoBoost in that it uses a wet belt. Now, a bit like the EcoBoost, over time the wet belt disintegrates and then you get oil starvation and ultimately engine failure. This is a huge issue and it affects thousands of cars and it's a very costly repair. Now, the annoying thing is, this is why these brands are at fault. People buy something like a 208 because they need a small, reliable car that's cheap to run and cheap to maintain. And this just isn't. You'll buy something like this for a few £1,000s and assume that you've got a decent, sensible, reliable car for the next 5 years. But in reality, you'll end up spending thousands on it. My advice would be avoid it like the plague. Pick anything else. Something like a Ford Fiesta with the 1.25 litre engine, or something like a Suzuki Swift or a Toyota Yaris. Just don't buy the 1.2 litre PureTech. So I think that's about it. I hope you found this video useful and thanks for watching. Make sure you follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and TikTok. I'll leave the links below and I'll see you next time. Cheers guys.